Springfield, Vermont was like a picture-perfect postcard, a quiet, cozy town where everyone knew each other, and each day seemed to blend seamlessly into the next. Springfield was a place where time appeared to have stopped, preserving the ideal of the small American dream. Among the neat houses with well-kept lawns and white picket fences stood the Bennett family home on one of the town's most prestigious streets. Robert Bennett, the head of the family, was a respected businessman. He had built his construction company from the ground up, turning it into one of the most successful in the county. At 50, Robert was a man who embodied discipline and perseverance. His reputation as a man of his word made him not only successful but also revered in the community. Sarah Bennett, his wife, was a beloved teacher at the local school at 48. Her kindness and compassion were undiminished. She always knew how to connect with each student, and her classes were highly sought after. Sarah was the heart of the family, always supporting her children and husband, ensuring that their home remained a place of comfort and peace. Thomas and Emily, the Bennett children, seemed like the perfect teenagers. Thomas had just turned 18 and was preparing to attend college, planning to follow in his father's footsteps in business. Emily, a 16-year-old with a bright and talented disposition, dreamed of becoming an artist and often secluded herself in her room, painting her emotions and feelings on canvas. But behind this picture-perfect family facade lay a secret that threatened to destroy everything that seemed so flawless. Thomas and Emily, who had grown up side by side, had always been close. Their bond, initially innocent and childlike, had begun to take on darker forms over time. Thomas, usually calm and composed, had always been the dependable older brother. But in recent years, his feelings towards Emily started to change. He found it increasingly difficult to see her as just a little sister, a feeling, awe in his heart that both frightened and burdened him. Yet he couldn't fight it. He began to notice that his thoughts about her were becoming obsessive, and attempts to drown them out with schoolwork and sports only deepened his inner conflict. On her part, Emily began to sense something unusual in Thomas's behavior. She couldn't understand why he had become so distant and withdrawn, or why his eyes sometimes held a strange glint when they were alone. At times she caught herself realizing that her feelings towards him exceeded the boundaries of typical sibling affection. Her teenage emotions, fueled by her passion for artistic self-expression, only amplified her confusion. She painted images where her feelings for Thomas were hidden beneath layers of symbolism and allegory. Their secret connection, which they were afraid even to acknowledge, began to alter their relationship. They increasingly found excuses to be alone, hiding from prying eyes, unaware that their behavior had already begun to attract attention. Attention evenings when their parents were occupied became moments when they could be together trying to make sense of their feelings. This connection became a trap from which there was no escape. Their emotions, both terrifying and magnetic, started to tear them apart from within. They couldn't confess their feelings to each other, nor could they break the bond each day. They sank deeper into this dark abyss, not realizing that the consequences of their relationship would be catastrophic. May 2023. Thomas and Emily began spending more time together in secluded places where no one could see them. They started meeting in the woods outside town, venturing further from home so that no one would notice their disappearances. During this time, their bond grew even stronger, and they both knew they were on the brink of something they could no longer control. Thomas tried to find a way out of the situation, contemplating options from leaving home to attempting to suppress his feelings, but each time his thoughts returned to Emily as if she were his inevitable fate. June 2023. Emily, feeling that the situation had become unbearable, began writing a diary where she detailed her feelings for her brother. These entries became her only way to express everything she couldn't say out loud. However, the diary hidden under her pillow became another link in the chain of events leading to tragedy. July 202-3, the secret meetings continued and the tension grew. Detective Julia Harper entered their lives, noticing the strange behavior of Thomas and Emily. She instinctively felt that something was amiss in this family and began her own investigation, suspecting that something much darker lurked behind the facade of this perfect family. The moment was approaching when the illusion of the perfect family would shatter, exposing a tragedy that no one could have predicted. Thomas and Emily found themselves trapped in a situation of their own making, and the only way out was through chaos and destruction. Summer 2023 marked a turning point in the lives of Thomas and Emily. In their seemingly peaceful world, the cracks became increasingly apparent. Emily began to suffer from constant feelings of guilt and shame. Every day was a torment for her. The same question repeatedly ran through her mind. How did we get this far? She feared. Looking her parents in the eye, worried that they would see the secret she so carefully concealed. Emily often woke up at night drenched in cold sweat after nightmares where she saw herself and Thomas standing on the edge of an abyss. She became withdrawn, distancing herself from friends and abandoning her love of painting at school. Her teachers noticed that Emily was losing interest in her studies and often seemed lost in thought, as if completely disconnected from reality. She was no longer the cheerful girl everyone once knew. Thomas, on the other hand, tried to keep himself in check, but his inner demons gradually gained control. He became increasingly irritable and prone to aggression. Thomas started avoiding his father, fearing that he would uncover his feelings. He often spent time alone, lost in dark thoughts about what he and Emily had done. The thought that their bond was not just a mistake, but something much darker and destructive tormented him. Thomas took longer and longer walks trying to escape these thoughts, but the voices in his head, condemning him for what had happened, continued to grow louder. He didn't know how to silence them. Gradually, Thomas began to feel that he was losing control, and the fear of what he might do became his constant companion. Meanwhile, the Bennett's neighbor, Gary, the owner of a small cafe, began to notice the odd behavior of Thomas and Emily. Gary was always a keen observer, and his friendship with Robert Bennett gave him access to the smallest details of the family's life. He had known this family for many years and had always admired their closeness and successes. But now, something was clearly Miss Gary first sensed something was wrong when he saw Thomas and Emily leaving the house late one evening and heading toward the woods on the outskirts of town. This place was rarely visited, and Gary wondered why they would go there at such a late hour. He tried to dismiss it, but as these walks became more frequent, his concern grew one evening. As Gary was closing his cafe, he noticed Thomas and Emily sitting by the river in a secluded spot. Their conversation seemed tense. They were speaking in hushed tones, and when Gary tried to approach them to say hello, they quickly stood up and left as if afraid of being seen. This behavior struck Gary as odd, too strange for ordinary teenagers, and it sparked his suspicions. Gary wasn't one to panic easily, but something about Thomas and Emily's behavior troubled him deeply. He started keeping an eye on them, trying to understand what was going on. Each time he saw them leave the house, his concern grew. Gary noticed that their meetings were becoming more frequent and took place in locations where no one could see them. Gradually, paranoia began to take root in Gary's mind. He couldn't stop thinking that these kids were hiding something terrible. He didn't know what to do, whether to share his suspicions with Robert or just leave things as they were. But his own fears and guesses kept building up, turning the peaceful life in the town into a true nightmare. August 2023. Thomas and Emily began spending more and more time in the woods, avoiding people. They understood that their bond was becoming increasingly dangerous, but they couldn't stop. Gary, struggling with growing anxiety, started to suspect that there was something much darker behind their secret meetings than just youthful mischief. September 2023, Gary decided that he couldn't stay silent any longer. He reached out to Detective Julia Harper, sharing his observations with her. Julia, who had already suspected that something was wrong in the Bennett family, decided to launch her own investigation. She knew that time was running out and that they needed to act quickly before something irreversible happened. The first cracks in Thomas and Emily's life marked the beginning of the end. The secret they had so carefully hidden began to surface, threatening to destroy not just their lives, but the entire world. They knew by fall 2023. Events in Thomas and Emily's lives had begun to unravel their emotional stability completely. Emily, struggling to cope with guilt and her confused feelings toward her brother, decided to try to reconnect with those around her. She started socializing more with her classmates, attempting to distract herself from her inner turmoil. However, her attempts at building connections with others proved futile. Emily couldn't shake the constant feeling that her secret was about to be exposed, that everyone knew what lay behind her smile. This fear destroyed any possibility of normal interaction. Every new acquaintance ended in failure for her. Emily tried to start a relationship with a classmate named Jason, but each of their meetings was filled with awkwardness and underlying anxiety. Her thoughts inevitably returned to Thomas, making it impossible to develop any relationship. Soon, she completely distanced herself from Jason, which only deepened her isolation. Meanwhile, Thomas, seeing that Emily was trying to distance herself from him, sank deeper into his dark thoughts. His obsession with his sister had reached a point where he couldn't think about anything else. Every moment apart from her felt like losing a part of himself. These feelings grew into a fixation that their bond was something special, something they couldn't allow anyone or anything to destroy. Gradually, Thomas's obsession began to take on darker forms. He started noticing that Emily was pulling away from him, and this triggered a panic in him. Thomas began acting more aggressively. He would have jealous outbursts when he saw Emily talking to other guys, even if they were just her friends. He became enraged at the mere thought that someone could take his place in his sister's life. Emily tried to calm her brother, explaining that she needed space, that she wanted to be a normal girl and have normal relationships. But Thomas wouldn't accept this. His aggression increasingly turned into emotional manipulation. He started pressuring his sister, convincing her that they couldn't live without each other. He told her that their bond was the only thing that mattered, and that no one would ever understand them except themselves. Thomas manipulated Emily, making her believe that their love was unique and that she shouldn't listen to those around her who would never understand them. He insisted that they had to be together at any cost, even if it meant running away and leaving everything behind. These conversations became a nightmare for Emily. She realized that her brother was no longer in control of himself and that the situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. By October 2023, the tension between the siblings had reached its peak. Thomas began stalking Emily. Following her wherever she went, he would appear near her school, wait for her outside their home, giving her no moment of peace. And Emily felt trapped, without the strength or will to resist. She feared that Thomas was capable of something terrible. If she tried to leave one evening, when their parents were at work, Thomas created yet another scene. He locked himself in Emily's room, with her refusing to let her out until they talked. His voice had a threatening tone, and Emily realized that he might move from words to actions. Thomas accused her of betrayal, of wanting to leave him alone. He said that if she left, he wouldn't be able to go on living. That night became a turning point for Emily. She understood that she could no longer hide her fear and needed to find a way out of this nightmare. From that moment, their bond fully transformed into a painful knot that tightened more and more. Thomas and Emily, once close, were now prisoners of their own passion and fear. They understood that they were on a path that could only lead to disaster, but neither knew how to stop this relentless process. November 2023. Emily tried to seek help from her school friend Lisa, but couldn't explain what was really happening in her life. The fear of Thomas and the shame of what bound them were too overwhelming. She became even more withdrawn, avoiding any attempts at closeness. Thomas, on the other hand, started making plans for a future where it would be just him and Emily, with no one else. But he already knew that this plan might require extreme measures. The escalation of tension reached its peak, and the tragic path was already set. Thomas and Emily drifted further and further from reality, entangled in their feelings and fears. They stood on the edge of an abyss, and only time would tell who would make the first step toward the inevitable. November 2023, the days were growing shorter, and the tension between Thomas and Emily was growing stronger under the relentless pressure from Thomas. Emily, exhausted by guilt and helplessness, finally agreed to his plan to run away. They began working out the details, filled with fear and uncertainty. Thomas convinced her that the only way to preserve their bond was to leave town and start over in a place where no one knew them and where they could hide from judgment and the law. The plan was risky and demanded quick action. Thomas meticulously thought through every detail. They would take only the essentials, leave their cell phones behind so they couldn't be tracked, and slip away into the night while their parents were sound asleep. They intended to leave as few traces as possible, ensuring that neither the police nor anyone else could find them. Emily felt the urgency of time slipping away. She constantly looked over her shoulder, convinced that their secret was already out. Every sound in the house, every footstep outside the door made her heart race. Thomas, on the other hand, was growing increasingly aggressive and insistent. He kept pressing that they needed to act immediately, that every minute of delay brought them closer to being exposed. His obsession with saving their forbidden love was only intensifying the night before their escape arrived faster than they expected. The oppressive silence in the house only heightened their anxiety. They packed their things in complete silence, trying not to make a single sound, when suddenly a floorboard creaked. Thomas and Emily froze. The door to their room flew open, and there stood Robert, their father. His face was twisted in confusion and suspicion. He looked at the suitcases and backpacks his children were hastily trying to hide and knew something was wrong. Robert demanded an explanation, his voice growing louder and more threatening. He wanted to know what they were planning, why they were packing in the middle of the night, and what secrets they were hiding. Thomas, gripped by panic, tried to keep his composure, but his desperation grew. With each passing second, he knew that if Robert found out the truth, it would all be over. His fear of losing Emily, who meant everything to him, overwhelmed him in that moment. Something inside him snapped. A surge of rage consumed Thomas in a fit of anger and despair. He grabbed his father by the shoulders and shoved him with force. Robert, caught off guard, lost his balance and fell backward. Time seemed to slow as his body tumbled down the stairs. The dull thud of his head hitting the wooden steps echoed through the house. Emily screamed, but it was more of a rasping sound. She rushed to her father, but it was too late. Robert lay motionless, his eyes open, but devoid of life. Emily stared at her father's body, unable to believe what had just happened. Her world collapsed in an instant. She felt the ground give way beneath her feet, and terror consumed her. But instead of panicking, she instinctively knew they had no choice. Now Thomas, still in shock, stared at his father, unable to move. Emily, summoning all her strength, grabbed her brother's hand and began urging him to run. Her voice trembled, but there was a steely determination in it. She understood that their lives were now completely shattered, that there was no turning back. And if they didn't leave immediately, they would be caught, and things would end even worse. Thomas, still in a daze, reluctantly agreed. They gathered the remaining items and left the house, leaving behind only death and chaos. The night was dark, the air cold and damp. They raced through the streets, not looking back, not thinking about where they were going. Their hearts were filled with fear and desperation, and ahead of them lay only an unknown, terrifying path. Thus began their flight, fraught with dark forebodings and the inevitable catastrophe that loomed over them. The night, shrouded in darkness and cold, marked the beginning of their frantic escape on December 10th, 2023. Thomas and Emily left the house where tragedy had just occurred, leaving behind everything they knew and loved. Their hearts pounded in unison with their hurried steps, their thoughts tangled in fear and despair. In the darkness of Springfield, they ran, trying to evade the justice that they were now certain would inevitably catch up with them. But the further they went, the more paranoia began to set in. Thomas and Emily could no longer even trust each other. Every step was accompanied by the torturous feeling that someone was watching them, that someone was about to catch them. They avoided crowded places, fearing they would be recognized, and hid in the shadows, where the fear only grew around every corner and every passerby. They saw a threat they didn't know where to go, had no plan, and most importantly, no idea how to escape the guilt that was slowly eating them alive. Their entire existence became a never-ending flight to nowhere, where reality ID started to warp and distort under the pressure of fear and horror. Soon their escape turned into a living nightmare. After days of wandering nameless roads and nights spent in cheap motels, Emily began noticing strange things. Creeping into her consciousness, she couldn't shake the horrific visions that haunted her at all hours. The scene of her father's death replayed over and over in her mind, his body lying on the floor, blood slowly spreading across the wooden steps, almost as if it were alive. Soon these visions turned into hallucinations. Her father would rise from the floor, reach out to her, his dead eyes staring into her soul, accusing and cursing her. Thomas was not immune to this madness either. He began hearing his father's voice, stern and full of condemnation. The voice echoed in his head, sometimes growing louder and more insistent. It reproached Thomas, called him a traitor, and a murderer, told him that their life was now a punishment for what they had done. Thomas tried to fight it, but the harder he tried, the more the voice took hold of his mind. Soon Thomas could no longer tell where reality ended, and this nightmare began. Paranoia and guilt pulled them into an endless vortex of terror from which there seemed to be no escape. They stopped trusting each other. Every glance, every gesture seemed suspicious. Emily withdrew further into herself, while Das began to lose control of his emotions, sinking into a pit of despair and self-destruction. Their physical condition also deteriorated, endless hours without sleep, and the constant fear of being caught led to exhaustion. They could barely eat, could hardly think of anything other than the terror that followed them at every step. Thomas began wasting away, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow and lifeless. Emily didn't look much better. Her once lively face was now pale with dark circles under her eyes, and it seemed she was living on the edge of a nervous breakdown. With each passing day, their flight became more chaotic and desperate. They tried to get as far away as possible from the place where their tragedy began, but the horror kept following them like a shadow. Every night, they woke up in cold sweats, hearing screams and seeing ghostly images in the dark. Their minds were torn between the desire to end it all and the fear of the inevitable reckoning. This unbearable reality, where each new day brought more suffering, had turned their lives into an endless nightmare. They no longer lived, but merely existed, sinking deeper into the abyss of despair and terror. December 20th, 2023, marked the day when Thomas and Emily Bennett's escape reached its dramatic conclusion. After weeks of futile attempts to stay hidden, they found refuge in an old abandoned house on the outskirts of town. This house, long forgotten and deserted, became their final sanctuary, the place where their mental state reached its breaking point. Detective Linda Morris, known for her sharp mind and keen intuition, had finally tracked them down. By piecing together their route through surveillance footage and witness statements, Thomas and Emily, already broken by internal horror and guilt, didn't expect to be found so soon. Morris, arriving at the scene with a team of officers, left them no chance of escape when the police surrounded the house. Thomas and Emily didn't even try to hide. It was as if they had lost the will to live. Emily, upon seeing the detective, Ives broke into hysteria, screaming and begging to be left alone. She tried to convince Morris that they were innocent, that it was all some terrible misunderstanding, but her words were incoherent, full of despair and fear, which only solidified the police's belief that they were witnessing a tragic conclusion. Thomas, in contrast, seemed completely detached. He sat on the floor, unresponsive to his sister's cries, and the police orders to stand up and surrender. His gaze was empty, and it appeared he had already given up inside. When they lifted him and placed handcuffs on him, he didn't even try to resist. Only a single tear rolled down his cheek as he finally met Linda Morris's eyes, realizing this was the end after the arrest. when the police began a thorough search of the house, they discovered a small box hidden under old furniture. In one of the rooms inside were diaries and letters that Thomas and Emily had written to each other over the past several months. These records became key evidence revealing the dark world in which they had lived. Emily's diary was filled with entries about her internal struggle, the guilt that tore her apart, and the fear that their love would lead to disaster. She described how each day became a trial for her, how she tried to find a way out of the situation, but her feelings for her brother always overpowered her. Her letters to Thomas, full of passion and despair, reflected her helplessness in the face of this forbidden love. Thomas's writings, on the other hand revealed a different spectrum of emotions. His diary was a testament to his growing obsession with Emily. He detailed his feelings for her, his jealousy of others who might get close to her. His letters were laced with threats and a conviction that they couldn't live without each other, that their bond was something unique that no one could ever understand or break. These writings left no doubt that their mental states were on the brink of catastrophe. They knew their love was forbidden, but they couldn't let go of it. The diaries and letters became crucial evidence in the case, proving that Thomas and Emily were aware they were heading down a path to inevitable tragedy. These documents were presented in court and were a decisive factor in the verdict. The revelation of these writings shattered the image of the perfect Bennett family, exposing the horrific secrets that led to their downfall. The diaries were the final proof of how powerful emotions and internal conflicts could destroy even the closest of people, turning their lives into a nightmare from which there was no escape. On March 25, 2024, the judge delivered a verdict that marked the culmination of one of the most shocking trials in Springfield's history. Thomas and Emily Bennett were found guilty of the murder of their father, Robert Bennett. The trial was long and agonizing, with numerous recesses, as the defense attorneys tried to present psychological evaluations, arguing that the defendants' mental states should mitigate their punishment. The judge, though considering the mental conditions of Thomas and Emily, could not overlook the brutality of their crime. There was no justification they could offer to the law or society. Thomas was sentenced to 25 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years, but with mandatory psychiatric supervision. Emily, whose role in the crime was seen as complicity under duress, received 20 years with the possibility of parole after 15 years, all with mandatory psychiatric treatment. Throughout her sentence, on the day the verdict was announced, the courtroom was silent. Thomas and Emily's eyes were dull, showing no emotion when the judge delivered the sentence. Emily quietly wept, tears streaming down her cheeks, but she didn't say a word. Thomas, on the other hand, seemed completely detached from the proceedings, his face a mask of indifference. But inside each of them, a storm of emotions was tearing them apart. They realized they had lost everything: each other, their family, their freedom, and perhaps even themselves. After the trial, the town of Springfield would never be the same. The Bennett home, once a symbol of peace and prosperity, became a grim monument to destruction. The townspeople, shaken by the horror, began avoiding even talking about the story, as if fearing that mentioning the tragedy might awaken dormant nightmares. Local legends quickly spread throughout Springfield. Some said the Bennett house was cursed. Some claimed they heard strange sounds coming from its walls at night. Others said they saw shadows in the windows. Even though the house had long been abandoned, people began to believe that the Bennett tragedy had permanently scarred the place, and that anyone who dared enter the house might encounter the same madness that destroyed this family. Robert Bennett's business was shut down, and his partners tried to forget about their past. Sarah, the mother of Thomas and Emily, was found in a state of shock in her room a few days after the verdict was announced. She was hospitalized and remained isolated from the outside world for a long time. The locals, fearing they might become involved in this curse, stopped talking about the Bennett family and even avoided mentioning their name. The town sank into an atmosphere of fear and suspicion, where everyone felt that the horror of this story could touch them at any moment. After the sentencing, Thomas and Emily were sent to different prisons, isolated not only from each other, but also from the world they once knew. Their lives turned into an endless nightmare, where each day was filled with the pain of memories. Emily and her solitary cell suffered from constant nightmares, reliving her father's death over and over. Her mental state deteriorated, and she became increasingly withdrawn, refusing to communicate with prison psychologists in the rare letters she wrote but never sent. Emily addressed Thomas, begging him for forgiveness, and forgiving him in return. Thomas, in his cell, also found no solace. He heard his father's voice, accusing him of betrayal and destroying the family. These hallucinations became part of his daily life, and he sank deeper into the abyss of despair. Thomas barely interacted with other inmates, spending most of his time in silence, except for the rare moments when he argued out loud with someone no one else could hear. Springfield, once a peaceful and prosperous town, would never recover from this tragedy. The Bennett family story became entrenched in local folklore, serving as a grim warning to anyone who dared to ignore taboos and hide the truth. Legends of the cursed Bennett house would be passed down from generation to generation, a reminder that even the quietest and most peaceful places can harbor the darkest secrets. The townspeople no longer spoke of the story aloud, but everyone knew that the shadow of the tragedy still lingered over their homes, and while Springfield eventually returned to its routine, the people knew the horror that once befell their town could return if they allowed their dark sides to surface again. Thank you for being with me so far in the video. If you like it, and subscribe to our channel to see more videos. Thank you all.